Most people think the story started the night an entire upscale neighborhood lost power in the middle of a brutal Arizona heat wave. They picture flames shooting out of a transformer, fire trucks blocking the entrance, and 18 families standing outside their million-dollar homes wondering why everything had suddenly gone dark. Truth is, it started with my old Labrador barking twice one Tuesday morning. My name is Ethan Calloway. I'm 48 years old, and I've spent more than half my life working as a licensed electrician around Mesa, Arizona. Electricity has a funny way of teaching you respect. You don't argue with it, you don't bluff it, and you definitely don't ignore it when it's trying to warn you something's wrong. I wish the people living around me had understood that before they decided my dog was somehow their biggest problem. My house sits on the last corner lot that never got redeveloped. Every other property around me has become these gorgeous modern homes with polished concrete driveways, giant windows, expensive landscaping, and enough outdoor lighting to make the neighborhood visible from space. Meanwhile, my place still looks like it belongs in an old family photo album. The paint is faded, the porch creaks when you step on it, and the giant mesquite tree in my front yard has probably been there longer than most of my neighbors have been alive. I love that house because it isn't just mine. It belonged to my grandfather before me, then my parents, and now me. Every scratch on those wooden floors tells a story. Every nail in those walls reminds me that not everything valuable has to sparkle. Apparently, the Homeowners Association disagreed. Their president was a woman named Danielle Pierce, mid-50s, always dressed like she was heading to a television interview instead of a board meeting, drove a brand new black Range Rover that somehow looked cleaner every single day despite living in the desert. Danielle had this incredible talent for smiling while insulting you. You'd walk away wondering whether she'd just complimented you or called you an embarrassment. The first time we met, she looked across my yard, tilted her sunglasses down, smiled politely and said, "Your property has character around there." That wasn't a compliment. Then came that Tuesday morning. My Labrador, Cooper, heard the mail truck like he always did. 2 barks. That's it. Not 20. Not nonstop. Just 2 deep warning barks before lying back down on the porch. 5 minutes later, somebody started pounding on my front door hard enough to shake the old glass windows. I opened it to find Danielle standing there holding one of those oversized iced coffees like it was some kind of prop. "Your dog interrupted my meditation," she announced before I could even say good morning. I blinked. "I'm sorry." "What?" "Every morning I meditate on my patio at 7:15. Your dog barked. I expect you to handle it." I looked behind me. Cooper was already asleep again. He barked twice. Twice too many. I couldn't help smiling. "Ma'am, he's a dog." Her expression hardened immediately. "And I'm the HOA president." There it was. That sentence explained everything. She wasn't looking for an apology. She was reminding me who she thought was in charge. I shrugged and said, "Have a good morning." Then I gently closed the door. I figured that would be the end of it. It wasn't even close. That afternoon, I found a violation notice taped across my front door. Excessive animal disturbance. $150 a day until corrected. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. 2 days later, a certified letter arrived quoting HOA bylaws I'd never seen before. Then another one accusing me of reducing neighborhood property values. After that came anonymous complaints about my fence, my mailbox, weeds that didn't exist, even the color of my porch light. It became obvious pretty quickly this wasn't about Cooper anymore. Danielle wanted me gone. The funny thing was, I'd heard rumors about that for years. Developers had tried buying my property more than once. Investors left handwritten notes in my mailbox. Realtors knocked on my door offering ridiculous amounts of money because my corner lot connected perfectly with the subdivision entrance. Every time I said no. My grandfather used to tell me, "Never sell something you don't fully understand." Back then I thought he was talking about family history. Turns out he meant paperwork. One evening after another violation notice showed up, I climbed into the attic and pulled down an old cedar box I'd inherited after my dad passed away. Inside were faded surveys, handwritten notes, engineering sketches, and property documents dating back decades. Dust covered everything. Some papers practically crumbled when I unfolded them. I almost gave up after an hour, because most of it looked like ancient legal language nobody had read in 50 years. Then one yellowed survey caught my eye. It showed my property exactly as it looked before the subdivision existed. I noticed one handwritten notation boxed in red pencil. Utility easement retained by grantor, permanent access rights reserved. I frowned. That couldn't be right. I kept reading, and the more I read, the quieter the room became. My grandfather hadn't simply kept our house when he sold the surrounding farmland decades ago. He had quietly retained ownership of a small section of utility property sitting exactly where the neighborhood's primary electrical transformer had eventually been installed. Even stranger, the maintenance agreement attached to that easement had a renewal clause. I flipped through more documents until I found the final page. The agreement had expired over a year earlier. Nobody had renewed it. Nobody had even noticed. I leaned back in my chair staring at that faded signature from my grandfather, then looked out the attic window toward the transformer humming quietly behind the neighborhood landscaping. That's when I finally understood why he'd always smiled whenever somebody asked why he never sold that last corner lot. If you'd like to hear what happened after I realized the HOA's entire electrical system depended on a piece of land they no longer legally controlled, I must have read those documents 20 times that night because I honestly couldn't believe an entire neighborhood full of attorneys, executives, and people who never missed an HOA meeting had overlooked something that important. Then again, maybe they never looked in the first place. That's the thing about old paperwork. Everyone assumes someone else already checked it. My grandfather grew up during a time when people shook hands before they signed contracts, but he also believed every promise should survive on paper. Apparently that habit had outlived everyone except me. The next morning I drove down to the county recorder's office carrying copies of every survey and agreement I could find. I wasn't trying to start a fight. I wanted someone to tell me I'd misunderstood everything. Instead, the clerk spent almost an hour pulling archived records before finally looking over the counter and saying, "Mr. Calloway, unless something was privately renewed and never recorded, these utility access rights reverted to your property when the maintenance agreement expired." I asked her to repeat it because hearing those words once wasn't enough. She did. Then she smiled and added, "I'm guessing somebody's going to have a very uncomfortable conversation." She had no idea how right she was. Before I made a single move, I called an old friend named Frank Delgado. Frank had spent 30 years working utility inspections before retiring. We met for breakfast at a little diner. Neither of us had stopped visiting since the 90s. I spread the paperwork across the table. Frank adjusted his reading glasses, looked through every page without saying much, then slowly leaned back. "You know what's sitting on this easement?" he asked. "The neighborhood transformer." "Not just any transformer," he corrected. "A 40-year-old distribution transformer that should already be on borrowed time in this kind of heat." "How bad?" I asked. He stirred his coffee before answering. "If maintenance crews can't inspect it regularly during peak summer loads, eventually it'll tell everybody exactly how bad." Neither of us smiled after that. I wasn't looking to destroy anything. I never wanted families sweating inside dark homes. But I also wasn't going to let Danielle bully me off land my family had protected for 70 years. So instead of making threats, I decided to do everything exactly by the book. 3 days later, a fencing contractor arrived at my property. We installed an 8-foot galvanized chain-link fence surrounding the entire utility easement. Heavy steel posts, reinforced concrete footings, locking commercial gate, bright reflective signs every 15 feet reading private utility easement. Authorized access only. Every permit required by the city sat neatly inside a waterproof folder hanging beside the gate. Everything was legal. Everything was documented. The neighborhood noticed before lunchtime. People slowed their golf carts just to stare. Kids riding bicycles pointed at the fence like somebody had built a prison in the middle of paradise. Around dinner, Danielle marched across the street with 3 HOA board members following behind her like backup singers. She stopped outside the fence, folded her arms, and called my name. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" I walked over carrying copies of the recorded easement documents. "Protecting my property," she laughed. "That equipment belongs to the community." "The equipment might," I answered calmly, "but the land underneath it doesn't." I handed her the paperwork. She barely glanced at the first page before pushing it back toward me. "Our attorneys will deal with this. I'm counting on that." Her face twitched just enough for me to know she'd expected an argument instead of paperwork. She wasn't prepared for documents older than the subdivision itself. The next morning, I mailed certified letters to the utility company, the HOA, and Danielle personally. Every letter said exactly the same thing. Until a new maintenance agreement could be negotiated, all access to the easement would require my written authorization in accordance with recorded property rights. I wasn't refusing forever. I was simply insisting they follow the law they expected everyone else to follow. Danielle answered with another violation notice taped to my mailbox. Unauthorized fencing, visual nuisance, failure to comply with community standards. I almost framed it. By the end of the week, the neighborhood Facebook page had turned me into the local villain. Somebody posted pictures of the fence calling me selfish. Another neighbor claimed I'd endangered public safety. One person wrote that I was probably trying to extort the HOA. Funny thing was, not one of them knocked on my door to ask why I had done it. They already had Danielle explaining everything for them. Every afternoon I'd sit on my porch with Cooper lying beside me, listening to that transformer hum across the fence. Most people hear electricity as silence. Electricians don't. We hear vibrations, tiny changes in pitch, small warnings hiding inside familiar sounds. As temperatures climbed past 110 degrees, the humming slowly deepened. Air conditioners kicked on earlier every day. Pool pumps ran non-stop. Electric vehicle chargers stayed plugged in all night. The transformer never got a break. On Saturday afternoon, I noticed something else. A maintenance truck pulled into the subdivision. Two utility technicians climbed out carrying inspection equipment before stopping at my locked gate. One of them read the signs, looked at the lock, then called dispatch. I walked over before they left. "Afternoon, gentlemen." The older technician nodded politely. "You the property owner?" "I am. We've got a scheduled inspection. I'd be happy to authorize access after we verify the maintenance agreement." He sighed. "We've been told there's some disagreement." "Not a disagreement," I replied. "Expired contract." He looked through the paperwork I handed him, then exchanged a long look with his partner. "We'll report this back to engineering." They packed their tools and drove away. I watched Danielle standing across the street recording the entire interaction with her phone, probably convinced she'd just captured evidence against me. She hadn't realized those technicians never argued because they already knew I wasn't making anything up. Monday arrived with another heat advisory. 113 degrees. The kind of heat that makes your steering wheel feel like a frying pan. Around 4 in the afternoon, every compressor in the neighborhood seemed to kick on at once. I could actually hear the electrical load increase. The transformer's low, steady hum became rougher, almost like an old truck struggling uphill. Cooper lifted his head from the porch and looked toward it. Animals notice strange sounds before people do. Tuesday morning, Danielle was back outside directing landscapers as if nothing had happened. She spotted me watering my tomato plants and smirked. "Enjoy your little stunt while it lasts." I smiled back. "I'm enjoying the weather." She rolled her eyes. "Our lawyers say you'll be removing that fence." "Then I suppose they'll be calling me soon." They never did, probably because somebody finally read the easement documents. By Wednesday evening, I caught the faint smell of heated insulation drifting across the road. Most people wouldn't recognize it. To me, it smelled like overtime. I walked over as close as the fence allowed and listened. The transformer wasn't screaming yet, but it was definitely complaining. Thursday became the hottest day of the summer. News stations warned people to stay indoors. The entire subdivision looked deserted except for sprinklers fighting a losing battle against the desert sun. Around 6:25 that evening, I heard it. A sharp metallic pop followed by an aggressive buzzing that immediately raised every hair on my arms. I stood up so fast, my chair tipped over backward. Cooper barked once and backed toward the porch. Then came another pop, louder this time, followed by a spray of bright blue sparks shooting through the ventilation openings near the top of the transformer. Within seconds, gray smoke curled upward into the still evening air. Neighbors began opening their front doors. Confused by the sound, someone shouted, "What was that?" Then the transformer let out one violent groan before flames burst from one side of the steel housing. Every light in all 18 houses disappeared at exactly the same moment. Air conditioners stopped. Garage doors froze halfway open. The entire subdivision fell into an eerie silence broken only by distant car alarms and people yelling each other's names. Fire engines arrived within minutes, lights flashing across darkened homes. But when firefighters rushed toward the transformer, they stalked at the locked gate surrounding my easement. The captain looked directly at me across the street and shouted, "Sir, do you have the key?" I reached into my pocket, looked once toward Danielle, standing barefoot in her driveway with absolute disbelief written across her face, and quietly walked toward the gate. If you want to see how one locked gate changed the balance of power in that neighborhood forever, I pulled the key out of my pocket, walked toward the gate as calmly as if I were unlocking my own backyard, and for just a second I caught Danielle staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't anger anymore. It wasn't confidence either. It was the look someone gets the exact moment they realize they've been playing a game without knowing all the rules. I unlocked the chain, swung the gate open, and stepped aside so the firefighters could get in. "It's all yours," I told the captain. Within minutes, the flames were under control. But the damage had already been done. The old transformer was finished. The entire subdivision remained dark while temperatures outside still hovered above 100 degrees. Families gathered on sidewalks holding battery-powered fans. Kids cried because the Wi-Fi was gone. Electric vehicle owners suddenly realized charging stations don't matter when the neighborhood has no electricity. It was surreal watching a community built around convenience discover how fragile convenience really is. About an hour later, 2 utility inspectors arrived along with an investigator from the fire marshal's office. I stayed quiet while they examined the transformer, photographed every angle, and reviewed maintenance records. Eventually, one inspector walked over carrying a clipboard. "Mr. Mystery Calloway, you're the easement owner?" "Yes, sir." He nodded. "Can we see your documentation?" I handed him the same folder I'd been carrying all week. He read every page carefully before looking toward the HOA representatives who had finally gathered together near Danielle's driveway. "Did your association renew this maintenance agreement after expiration?" Silence. Danielle looked at another board member. The board member looked at their attorney. Nobody answered. The inspector finally broke the silence himself. Then maintenance access became a legal issue that should have been resolved long before today. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Facts usually speak louder than arguments. The following morning, the official report started coming in. Preliminary findings concluded the transformer had experienced progressive overheating consistent with delayed maintenance on aging equipment operating under extreme summer demand. The utility company assessed the HOA for substantial equipment replacement costs because the contractual maintenance obligations had never been properly renewed. The fire marshal also ordered temporary 24-hour site monitoring until replacement equipment could be installed safely. Insurance wasn't much help either. Their carrier determined that the lapse in maintenance agreements created coverage complications, meaning the association would be responsible for expenses that nobody had budgeted for. Overnight, the conversation inside the neighborhood changed completely. Nobody cared about my dog anymore. Nobody mentioned my porch paint. Nobody complained about my fence. They only wanted to know how their board had missed something so important. 2 days later, I noticed something that honestly made me feel a little sorry for Danielle. A silver sedan pulled into my driveway. Not the polished luxury SUV she'd always driven, but an older family car. She stepped out wearing jeans, tennis shoes, and a plain gray t-shirt. No designer sunglasses. No expensive coffee. She looked exhausted. She stood on my porch for several seconds before knocking softly. When I opened the door, she didn't speak right away. Finally, she sighed and said, "May we talk?" I invited her onto the porch. Cooper walked over, sniffed her hand, then quietly lay back down. She actually smiled at him. "He's a good dog," she whispered. "He's always been a good dog," I answered. She nodded without arguing. That alone told me how much had changed. "The neighborhood needs permanent access," she said. "I know. Would you consider negotiating?" I disappeared inside for a moment and returned with a folder I prepared the night after finding my grandfather's paperwork. I'd spent hours working through every clause with my own attorney because I never wanted anyone accusing me of taking advantage of the situation emotionally. I placed the agreement on the small table between us. It established a long-term easement lease with annual compensation reflecting the property's utility value, required scheduled inspections, advance notice for non-emergency access whenever practical, clear maintenance responsibilities, and legally defined protections for both sides. It wasn't revenge. It was structure. Danielle slowly read every page. "You're asking us to actually respect the easement from now on," she finally said. "That's all I've ever asked." She looked up at me. "If we'd done this months ago," I finished the sentence for her, "your neighborhood probably never would have lost power." She closed the folder and quietly admitted something I never expected to hear. "I thought you were being difficult because you hated the HOA." I smiled. "No, I hated being treated like I didn't belong in the place my family built before the HOA even existed." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she stood, reached out her hand, and said, "I should have knocked on your door to have a conversation, instead of declaring a war." I shook her hand. Within the next week, the homeowners approved the agreement. A new transformer was installed. Maintenance schedules were updated, and several board members resigned after residents demanded accountability. Danielle stepped down shortly afterward. I haven't seen her at another HOA meeting since. As for Cooper, he still sits on the front porch every morning at exactly 7:15. Sometimes the mail truck rolls by and he gives those same two deep barks he's given for years. The difference now is nobody storms across the street. A few neighbors even wave at him. Looking back, I don't think this story was ever really about electricity, fences, or homeowners associations. It was about what happens when people become so convinced they're entitled to control someone else that they stop listening, stop asking questions, and stop respecting history. My grandfather used to tell me that every piece of land remembers the people who cared for it. I finally understand what he meant. He wasn't protecting a corner lot. He was protecting the right of future generations to stand their ground without raising their voice. So now, I want to ask you something. If you were in my position, would you have unlocked that gate the moment the firefighters arrived? Or would you have handled the entire situation differently? And do you think Danielle deserved a second chance after everything she did? Or was losing her position the only fair ending? Let me know down in the comments because stories like this always spark strong opinions. And honestly, I'd really like to hear yours.